So Dr. Richard Buckley is a graduate in archaeology from Durham University in the United Kingdom, and he has spent in the entirety of his career, and I guess maybe you don't mind if I say how long that is, right? Nearly 40 years, working in and around Leicester, which in the Midlands area of England, doing very complex archaeology, because what he's dealing with there, unlike anything we would have in Shreveport or this area, he's dealing with archaeology that is Roman and medieval, often in an urban setting. So there's a real challenge there for that. So the background of what you're going to hear today is a little bitty 30-year conflict in English history known as the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster. You have these rival families, actually the same family, rival factions of that family, framing up the story. King Richard III is the last of the Yorkist line of kings. He was killed at Bosworth Field in August of 1485 in battle against Henry Tudor, literally in a battle for the throne of England. He has been immortalized in Shakespeare's play for us, Richard III, but his mortal remains were lost to history for over 500 years. There were some competing stories about where he might be, if he might be anywhere at all anymore. So in August and September of 2012, a team of archaeologists at the University of Leicester, led by our speaker today, Dr. Richard Buckley, set out to search for the final resting place of Richard III. Against all odds, really, and I think given the circumstance he's going to outline for you, you're going to see how incredibly remarkable it is that this find was even came to fruition. The project not only proved to be incredibly successful in locating the remains of a 13th century Greyfriars Franciscan friary in Leicester that he had long wondered about, but also, of course, the mortal remains of Richard III. This generated a lot of press interest around the world, and I think it's fair to say that it's still, albeit well, 5-6 years later, it's still an incredible story. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Buckley.
Thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here again in Shreveport. This is my second visit, and it's great also to be missing the wintry weather. Now, of course, you all know exactly what we found and when we found it, so I can't really sort of unfold this in a dramatic way and build the tension. So I'm going to start with the first slide, which is actually the very moment of discovery on August the 25th of 2012. In the 6th hour of the excavation, we found 2 human leg bones on the site. We didn't know whose they were. We didn't even know whether they were inside a building or outside a building. But nevertheless, these 2 human leg bones were carefully covered up, and then we did further work on the site, and eventually it turned out that these legs were indeed those of Richard III. So it was a very auspicious moment, and it genuinely did darken, the sky darkened like that, and there's a brief thunderstorm. So read into that what you will, but that's what actually happened. Now the project really started for me back in January of 2011. This was when we had a slightly strange phone call in the office. My normal job, as Gerald says, is to deal with archaeology in connection with development, but occasionally we get what I would call bonkers phone calls. Some people who are possibly slightly off the rails, who have some rather crazy ideas they wanted to bring to fruition for them. In this instance, it was certain Philippa Langley, who was the, is that all right? Certain Philippa Langley, who was the secretary of the Richard III Society in Scotland, and she had this idea that we could actually go to Greyfriers in Leicester and find the remains of King Richard, and they could be then reinterred in the cathedral. Now, Philippa was completely optimistic about this, to the extent that she'd even had a coffin designed and a form of service. So I had to sort of let her down a bit gently and say that really, you know, there's a lot to do, and it was very much a long shot, so, you know, don't be too hasty in starting to build a coffin, that's for sure. And I think the other thing to say really is, as archaeologists, we almost never go in search of named individuals or the rich and famous. We're much more interested in learning about ordinary folks. So in Leicester, at any time you go there may be an excavation in progress where we're quite happy digging in the backyards of Roman or medieval properties and sifting through the contents of latrine pits and things like that to find out what people ate and what sort of lifestyle they had. So that's the sort of thing we quite like doing. Now I can say, put my hand on my heart and say that's true, because we've done a lot of work also at Leicester Abbey, another great religious house that was dissolved by Henry VIII, and there another famous personage was laid to rest, and that's Cardinal Wolsey, who was on his way to London to face the wrath of Henry VIII in 1530, and came to Leicester Abbey with a stomach complaint and announced to the abbot that he was going to lay his bones amongst them. And so he's said to have been buried in the Lady Chapel, and we did 9 seasons of excavation at Leicester Abbey, but not once were we tempted to look in the Lady Chapel. Instead, we looked down here at the kitchens, and we sifted through the drains and found rodent bones and fish scales and things to do with food preparation. And we also looked at the guest accommodation and the latrines that go with that. So I think that sums up really what archaeologists like doing. So in this instance, I think what attracted me to the project wasn't really the prospect of finding Richard III, it was more the chance to find a great lost medieval religious house of which nothing remained standing above ground at all. So that was what attracted me to it. Now, as we've heard, the Wars of the Roses was a conflict which dominated the 15th century. Now, many of you will probably know about it already, but just in case, here's my sort of 20-30 second version. So it's effectively 2 branches of the same family with a common ancestor of Edward III, so the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. So in the earlier part of the 15th century, Henry VI is on the throne, a Lancastrian king. He is then deposed by Edward of York, who becomes Edward IV, and that happens at the Battle of Towton in 1461, a very bloody battle, of which recently some of the great burial pits have been excavated. Then Henry is briefly reinstated in 1470-71, so not very long, because then comes back Edward of York again, resumes his reign, having defeated Henry's forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Also at this battle, Henry's son, Edward, just to really confuse you, his son is Edward, and he's Prince of Wales and is heir to the throne, but he is killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. So Edward is now confirmed on the throne. So here's Edward and his family. He's married to Elizabeth Woodville, and here are his children. In the middle here are the 2 sons, Edward Prince of Wales and Richard Duke of York. So Edward Prince of Wales, another Edward Prince of Wales, is heir to the throne when Edward IV dies. He dies in April 1483, and then his son Edward is proclaimed Edward V, but not crowned at this stage, because then there's a sudden change of events, and that's when the marriage of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville is declared invalid because Edward had a pre-contract with somebody else before he got married. So that then means that Edward and his brother are illegitimate. Uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is then declared king in June 1483. He puts the princes in the Tower of London, which is a royal palace, essentially, supposedly for their safekeeping. They then disappear mysteriously by the summer of 1483. This is one of the great mysteries of English history. And then the big question is, were they then murdered on the orders of wicked Uncle Richard, if he was a wicked uncle, or did they die of natural causes? Did they escape? Nobody knows. And that's one of the great mysteries of English history. So there's Richard now on the throne after a lavish coronation feast. But then his reign is then challenged by Henry Tudor, of another branch of the family, the Lancastrian branch, who takes on Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485, and Richard's killed, and so Henry becomes Henry VII of England. There will be a short examination paper at the end, so I hope we've got some of that anyway. So there's Richard III, and we hear from a contemporary historian, John Rouse, that he's at last buried in the choir of the Friars Minor at Leicester. That's the Franciscan friars. So we were very aware of that as archaeologists, that Richard was somewhere in a particular part of Leicester, but we knew not precisely where, or even whether the remains had survived the ravages of time. One story that was circulating was that Richard's bones had been dug up at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries in 1538 by an angry Leicester mob, as if they'd do such a thing, and hurled into the River Soar, which runs through the city. It's not quite the Red River or the mighty Mississippi, it's a fairly small river. Here is Bow Bridge, a medieval bridge still surviving in the 19th century, and his bones are meant to have been thrown in the river down there. And there's even a plaque on the wall that a local family put up saying near this spot lie the remains of Richard III. So that was one question, and a skull had been found in the river in the 19th century by a local family, and they had it hidden away in a cupboard in their house and claimed it was Richard III's skull. But unfortunately, at the time of our work, they couldn't find it. Such a big house and so many cupboards. But anyway, that was so one theory was that Richard was somewhere in the River Soar in Leicester, and it was commonly believed because thousands of cars passed that plaque every day of the week. So I kept a pretty open mind really at the beginning of this project as to whether we'd be successful or not. Now, just a bit of background really as to where Leicester is. I mean, many of you may not have heard of Leicester. It's a town right in the centre of England, about 100 miles north of London. It's a very ancient town with occupation from the 1st century BC in the Iron Age. It's a tribal centre of the Coriol-Tavi tribe. The Romans arrive about 50 AD and it becomes a major Roman town with a forum, a baths, temples and a theatre, town walls, defensive ditches and all that. So it's a major Roman town in England. The other thing to say about it is it's also was a great industrial centre right up until the 1980s, particularly the hosiery industry. So this is the Wolsey factory, named after Cardinal Wolsey, who claimed to be making the undergarments for the whole world. So I don't know whether undergarments from Leicester ever reached Shreveport, but maybe they did, I don't know. So a major industrial centre, and it was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe at one stage because of this industry. That, of course, collapsed in the 70s and 80s with Far Eastern imports and so on. And what that left us with was, here was the city centre looking approximately southwest in that direction. Here's the line of the Roman town defences, reused in the medieval period as well, but large areas of the city centre were occupied by factories that were then demolished, giving the opportunity for lots of new excavations to be done. So in particular, just here we excavated a medieval church, the Church of St Peter, and dug up 1,500 burials from that. Another one down here, Church of St Michael, 500 more burials, and then we dug up 5 nonconformist chapels with about another 600 or 700 burials. So there are loads and loads of human burials all over the place under the ground in Leicester. So that was what was going on up here. Where the Greyfriers Friary was is in an area where we haven't really done much work in that yellow zone, and that's because there are lots of high quality 18th and 19th century buildings which are not going to be developed. And so there are no opportunities to do any archaeology to speak of. And there'd only been 2 very small interventions in that area, I think a lift pit and a service trench, so we have no idea of the depth of the material above archaeology or what to expect. Now, the other thing just to mention briefly is that the archaeology doesn't necessarily survive that well. It's not Pompeian Herculaneum by a long shot. Our archaeology is very fragile and heavily disturbed. And that's really because there are no good stone sources near the city centre, and so each generation recycles materials from earlier buildings. So here we've got a couple of foundations of Roman walls. That's usually as good as it gets. The floor levels are often all disturbed. People have reused the tiles from the floors and everything. Very often it's even worse, and we find that they've even taken away the stone from the foundations as well. So in this instance, at the bottom here, where we've got something called a robber trench, and that's the line of where a wall used to be, and all the stone has been removed. So you just get a dark stain in the ground. So that's really as good as it gets. Now, I think the reason for telling you all this is just to sort of put in your minds how unlikely it was that we were going to find the remains of the king. Now, this is on the eve of the excavation, on the 24th of August of 2012. the university decided it was going to have a launch day on site, and we thought that the local press might come, the local radio station and the local paper. But we found ourselves absolutely swamped by the world's press. Not only sort of UK and European newspapers, but also North American newspapers, so San Francisco, New York, etc. They all visited the site to try and get the story. We also had some slightly odd requests, like an interview by the Voice of Russia radio station. We did an interview for Georgian television, that's Eastern European Georgia, and it was all very bizarre, but of course it's all because of Richard III, the Shakespeare play, and the fact that he's one of Britain's most controversial monarchs, and it's also the fact that it's a lost burial. It all makes it quite exciting. But what I think struck me at the time was that because I thought the chances of finding were so low, we were being set up to fail on an international level, and at some point we'd have to slink off and go into hiding while it all calmed down. Because what we had to do was achieve a series of objectives. So first of all, we've got to find the Franciscan Friary in the first place. There's no trace of it above ground. Within the friary, identify specific buildings. Now that's difficult if you have no floor levels, no wall decoration, anything like that. Then find the church, then locate the east end of the church, specifically the choir, and then locate the mortal remains of Richard III. No problem. Except the other thing you have to remember is that we had a very small budget. It was about, in pounds sterling, it was in about £35,000, which is what, I don't know, $45,000, something like that. Which sounds like quite a lot, but when you realise that we're going to be digging up the parking lot of the Social Services Department of the City Council, who were none too pleased, I have to say, we were going to have to reinstate the tarmac surface and all the car parking spaces. And all of that was going to cost at least half the budget. So we had about half left, and that equated to having a dig that would last for about 2 weeks with 3 members of staff, and it was a 1% sample of the site. 1%, that's all. So that was really why I was a little bit pessimistic, shall we say. And I suppose the other thing just going down that list, you can see that, yes, not realistically considered that we would find Richard III, to be honest, but we might get some traces of the friary if we were really lucky. The other thing I learned, I suppose, the hard way, was that when the press are about, you have to be very careful what you say. And I did say, if we find Richard III, I'll eat my hat. I think the university wanted me to be a bit more positive about it rather than that. And so, of course, I did end up eating my hat, but luckily in marzipan form. Anyway, so we had our launch day, and the project was about to go, and Philippa Langley had managed to raise money from the Richard III Society. The University of Leicester put some money in, and the city authorities put some money in as well. So it was all sort of going quite well. Now, just to give you a bit of background also on medieval Leicester, we've seen that aerial photograph of the historic core as it is now. This one is a reconstruction of how the town may have looked in the middle of the 15th century. So we've got the medieval town defences reused the Roman town wall. We've got a castle here founded in about 1068. Lots of houses in the middle, mostly sort of timber-framed houses. A large deserted area here because of the population decline in the 14th century, and that's why the churches of St Peter and St Michael became redundant and the sites were redeveloped. Then we've got the friaries. We've got the Augustinians here on an island between two arms of the River Soar, a very sort of inhospitable site because of the chance of flooding. We've got the Dominicans, the Blackfriars, in this corner of the town. They're still remaining rather elusive archaeologically. We've got some drains which may come from their friary, but we haven't yet found a church. And then we have the Greyfriers here in a very prime spot next to the commercial heart of the town where the markets are. And then finally up here we've got a religious enclosure that's founded by the Lancastrians, which contains the Church of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a hospital, chantry houses and a great gatehouse as well. So that's 15th century, and it's called, rather boringly, the New Work, so it becomes corrupted to Newark. So that's Leicester in the 15th century. Now the Greyfriars, we think, arrived about 1230 in Leicester, And we know that in the 1250s they were in the middle of constructing their church because they get timber from the king, Henry III. Apart from that, all we really hear about are people who were buried there. So, for example, there are provincials of the Greyfriers. They're the chief Greyfriars in the kingdom. So Peter Swinsfield and William of Nottingham. So they're buried there. Richard, of course, is buried there. A knight called Mutton, which may be Sir William de Mouton, and also Eleanor Lavener, who may be a benefactor of the friary. So that's more or less all we know about the friary. Apart from the very sad event in the 15th century, there's the friars. In the early 15th century, in 1402, this is when Henry IV, a Lancastrian king, is on the throne. He has deposed Richard II, but there's a rebellion in Wales against his reign, and the Leicester Friars decided to support that rebellion and also spread rumours that Richard II is actually still alive and is the rightful King of England. So they're all summoned to London to face the wrath of the king, and when Dr. Roger Frisbee is asked who's the rightful King of England, he gives the wrong answer and says Richard II. So they all come to a sticky end, executed in London, at the Tower of London. So that would have been very much in the memory of the town some 70 odd years later. Right, now back to the main story of the demise of Richard III. So in August of 1485, Henry lands at Milford Haven. I'm conscious I'm not doing this on both sides. It's I need two hands, really, two pointers, but I hope you can see all right. So Henry Tudor lands at Milford Haven with his mercenaries and other members of his army, marches across Wales via Shrewsbury and then down the Roman Road, Watling Street towards London, and he encamps at a place called Atherston on the Leicestershire-Warwickshire border. Meanwhile, Richard is in Nottingham, which is about 20 miles north of Leicester, and he plans to march down to Leicester where he's going to rendezvous with his northern contingent under the Earl of Northumberland, his east under the Duke of Norfolk, and his southern under Sir Robert Brackenbury. And his army is estimated to be around about 8,500 men, something like that. So by tradition, he marches into the town of Leicester through the North Gate, and there he's meant to have stayed in this medieval inn, probably called the White Boar, which is Richard's emblem, and he's meant to have stayed in this upper chamber, this gloomy upper chamber, on his own self-assembly bed that he brought with him. The bed was never reclaimed after the Battle of Bosworth for obvious reasons, and it then became a tourist attraction as the landlord and landlady of the inn tried to make a bit of money out of it. So the bed was one of the penny wonders of England. You paid your penny and saw King Richard's bed. And amazingly, it still survives, and it's in the collections of the County Museum Service. Having said that, it is highly dodgy. Bits of it could be 15th century, but most of it looks like it's probably 17th or 18th century. The inn, sadly, was demolished in the 19th century, and that did change its name after Bosworth to the Blue Boar from the White Boar, for obvious reasons. So he stays there the night, and then the next morning, with great pomp and ceremony, he leaves on his white charger with his army, who've been encamped around the town, heads off through the West Gate, over West Bridge, and then past the Austin Friars, then over Bow Bridge. And that's where he's meant to have banged his spurs against the parapet of the bridge, and an old crone sitting nearby then prophesies that the next time he passes that way, it will be the head of his dead body that hits that very spot. And then off he marches down towards where Henry's encamped, probably down the Roman road that leads from Leicester to a Roman settlement of Manchester. Now, lots of recent work has been done down at the Bosworth battlefield site. Lots of metal detector surveys which have revealed lots of lead shot straddling the line of this Roman road. And so we now think that this is the focus of where the battle was. Slightly inconveniently for Leicestershire County Council's visitor centre, which is a mile north where we used to think the battlefield was, but never mind. And one of the key discoveries also was this silver gilt boar badge that would have been worn by one of Richard's aristocratic retainers. Plus, a lot of the field names indicate it's marsh. So, obviously, famously, Richard became embedded in the mire and came off his horse. So we think this is now the focus of the battle itself. I won't go into too much detail on the battle, but you're probably all aware that Richard had seen an opening in the battle and decided to make a charge towards Henry Tudor's position with a view to taking him on in single combat. So he rode towards Henry Tudor. He took out Henry's standard bearer, Sir William Brandon, but then he himself was unhorsed and then killed on the battlefield. Here is in a recent illustration by Victor Ambrose showing him riding down Sir William Brandon, the standard bearer. So traditionally Richard was killed by a Welshman, Rhys ap Thomas, and we hear that his body was found amongst the slain. Many other insults were heaped on it, not very humanely. A halter was thrown around the neck and it was carried to Leicester. So that's from a broadly contemporary chronicle. So here he is in another drawing, the body slung over the horse. And we hear from another account that Richard late King was brought into that town for his body despoiled to the skin and naught being left about him so much as would cover his privy member. He was trussed behind a pursuivant called Norroy as a hog or another vile beast, and all besprung with mire and filth, was brought to a church in Leicester for all men to wonder upon. Now you might consider really, why is Richard being brought back to Leicester rather than being taken to London and put on display? I think it's really for the very obvious reason that most people in the kingdom wouldn't know what the king looked like. No photographs, obviously. And all they've got to go on are the coins, which, as you can see, are a bit on the schematic side. So what better place to take him than the city where several thousand people had seen him depart with great ceremony a few days before. So we think he's then brought back into Leicester, probably the same route that he took on his way to Bosworth, and there he's meant to be put on display in the Church of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so this is very much an added insult to the memory of a Lancastrian, to the memory of a Yorkist king, because it's a Lancastrian church with many tombs of prominent Lancastrians. So he's on display there for a few days. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor's army is fed and watered. There are a few people who are executed as reprisals. And eventually, Richard's body is taken to the Church of the Franciscan Friars, and they're buried in the choir, according to John Rouse, and without pomp or solemn funeral, according to the later writer Polydore Virgil. And there the remains stay, and about 10 years later, Henry Tudor actually pays for an alabaster slab to be placed over Richard's burial place with an image of him incised on the top of it, and also a plaque on the wall that probably says more about how great Henry Tudor is than how great Richard III was, as you'd expect. But he's at least acknowledging that a king has been buried in this church. The friary then is dissolved in 1538, and in common with all other religious houses in the kingdom, they're knocked down very quickly. The king doesn't want it to be possible that these houses can be re-inhabited by priests, so the churches are usually knocked down first. And Leicester's friaries and abbey were all knocked down in 1538, and so then the question is, what then happened to Richard's burial? Now the site of the friary changes hands a few times, and then eventually is bought by this man, Sir Robert Herrick, who is a former Lord Mayor of Leicester. He was born in 1540, so he may have met people who'd actually seen the church and the tomb when they were still there. Anyway, he has none other than a chap called Christopher Wren, who's the father of the architect of St Paul's. He's his children's tutor, and he's shown them the garden and shows them a stone pillar 3 feet high with the inscription, "Here lies the body of Richard III, sometime King of England." So Herrick believes that Richard is still there in his garden somewhere. Next thing then is, how do we know where the Greyfriars site actually is? Now, just to really confuse you, this map is a completely different orientation to all the other images we've seen, I'm afraid. We've been looking previously from this side, looking down across the town towards the southwest. But on this map, we've got, here's the River Soar at the bottom, north is that way, here is the Greyfriars, next to St Martin's Parish Church, now Leicester Cathedral. Now I can enlarge that and now put north to the top of this map, more conventionally. So you can see it says Greyfriars there. We've got the outline of walls of a building, probably Robert Herrick's mansion. And we've also got, tantalisingly, 4 little paths leading to a central spot. So like you think X marks the spot and that's where you need to dig your hole, but it doesn't usually happen like that. So that looks pretty promising. So by 1741, the site is largely gardens and orchards, so it hasn't been developed. The problem then comes when you overlay this with the modern map of Leicester, and you can see immediately the problem. All the blue areas are buildings. So some of them are very good quality buildings of the 18th century and 19th century. And all is left then are two parking lots, one just here and one just here. This one is in private ownership, and they were going to charge so much to remove all the cars that it wasn't a viable project, so that was ruled out. That then leaves us with this car park, which is the car park of the Social Services Department of the City Council, who, as I've said, weren't amazingly keen on losing their parking spaces. The other thing about it is it has lots of buried services running through it, so electric cables, fibre optics, sewers, gas pipes, you name it. And then finally we're left also with this area here, which is the playground of a disused school. So in all, we've got something like 15 or 16% potentially to go at, but we can only afford to do a 1% sample of the whole of the precinct. So where do you dig your holes is the big question. Here's the site from the air. You can see how heavily used it is by cars or parking in here. And also we've got a wall that divides the playground from the main part of the site as well, a very tall wall. Now, one thing you can try on a site that has a hard surface is a technique called ground-penetrating radar, which in very simple terms sends a signal into the ground, and depending on how long it takes to bounce back and its intensity, it can tell you where there are walls and things like that. We've tried it in Leicester a few times. It's always been an absolutely dismal failure. But we thought we'd have a go this time, but hey, guess what happened? It's another dismal failure. What it's revealing here are not plans of the friary buildings, but we've got things like the foundations of the bike sheds where the kids kept their bikes. We've got bits of garden wall and things. And then also all the red lines are all these cables and sewers and gas pipes. So it has at least helped us to site trenches to avoid shutting down the social services department, which is a good thing. So we've got to use other methods then really to think about how we can target the trenches. Now one thing at least with religious houses is the buildings are generally of a fairly common pattern. Here's the Austin Friars in Leicester, excavated back in the 1970s. So here you've got a church on the south side of a cloister, so an open courtyard with a walkway around it, the cloister alley. That leads to the chapter house with, at the first floor, the dormitory. And in this case, there's a second cloister with other ancillary buildings like the refectory and the kitchen and things like that. And so all the buildings are orientated west-east, as is normal. More usually, with Greyfriars, the church is on the north side of the cloisters, so you have a nave and two aisles, and you move from the nave into the walking place under the central tower of the building, and then into the choir, with choir stalls facing inwards, and then into the presbytery and the high altar. And also you go down from the walking place, down the cloister alley, and go into the chapter house, and have access to all these other buildings. So that's a more normal arrangement. Although there are 5 Greyfriars friaries in England which have the church on the south side, so again you have to keep a fairly open mind. So the obvious thing to me was first of all to try and look at different plans of friaries and rescale them, flip them and everything, move them around within the precinct and then think where we put the trenches. And in the end we did the fairly obvious thing of putting in 2 north-south trenches with the hope that we'd pick up some cross walls of these friary buildings and maybe work out where we were within the friary. So that's what we did. So here's Matthew, the site supervisor, with Leon about to lay out the trenches on the day after the big press event. Matthew tells me that he genuinely didn't spot this R painted on the car park. It doesn't mean here lies Richard III, it means that this is a reserved parking spot. Promise. But anyway, there was an R on the car park. So there's the first trench being excavated. So we machine off the overburden first. Watched by Philippa Langley and other members of the team. And it didn't look very prepossessing to start with. Lots of horrible brick foundations of outhouses associated with 18th century buildings nearby. By outhouse I mean the English version of an outhouse where you keep your lawnmower and your garden chairs. It means something different here, doesn't it? Anyway, so it looked as though it was all horribly disturbed, and at the end of the day we'd have to say, sorry, we gave it our best shot, but nothing there. But then, as we've heard, 2 leg bones turned up. Not a big surprise to find a burial on the site of the friary. There should be lots of burials. They were very carefully covered up until we knew a bit more about their context. Then we found, more interestingly, lots of stone rubble from a demolished building. And then the breakthrough came in that trench when we found the first evidence of a structure. I'm afraid it's not very easy to see, but this is the trench. It's about sort of 3 feet, 4 feet deep. Across here, ignore that for a minute, across here is what we call a robber trench, one of these ghost walls. We found another one down here. So we've got a building that's about 7.5 metres wide, running east-west, with piles of rubble in the middle, and also the mortar bedding for a tile floor, so the tiles had all been prized up, leaving the impressions there. Then also, interestingly, this stone foundation next to the robber trench, which seems to be a bench. So if you look at this view of it, you can see this stone thing has a flat top, so you'd sit there with your legs dangling down there and resting on the floor. And we found another one down here as well. So it looked as though we had a room where you would sit opposite each other to discuss things, which really narrows it down to being the chapter house, where daily the guardian of the friary would meet with the friars to discuss what they were going to do. So that's pretty good, because chapter houses are always on the east side of the cloisters and not that far from the church. So at that stage of the investigation, we dug the first trench and found these 2 walls. We also did another trench down here in pale blue and found a pair of walls running parallel with each other, suggesting maybe the walkway around the cloister alley. So when you put all that together, that then really narrows down the church to being either up here somewhere or down here. Now, because this playground was vacant, and because we had a little bit of money left, we decided to do another trench in here to test whether there's any evidence of any walls running in that direction. So there's the 3rd trench. So here we are excavating the 3rd trench, finding medieval floor tiles fairly quickly. So here's a load of medieval floor tiles being cleaned up. But what was interesting about those was that there were lots of different sizes and laid in a very haphazard fashion. Plus there was later material around them as well. So we think they're probably part of the garden paths of Robert Herrick's mansion. He's reused all these building materials. But more importantly, we found evidence for 2 huge walls running east-west. So one here and one here, and between them evidence for mortar floors with impressions of tiles. And this is about 10 metres between the 2 walls. It's a very large east-west building, so almost certainly the church. We also found burials, charnel of burials that had been disturbed at some point in the past and reburied. And then lots of architectural fragments, like these bits of window tracery and hood mouldings, which looked as though they were early perpendicular in style of about 1400 AD, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So on the strength of that, we had a bit more money left to then expand this trench to try and get an idea of whereabouts we were within the church. So the original trench is running across here. Here's the north and south wall. And so we extend it that way towards where the 2 leg bones have been found, westwards, and also eastwards towards where the high altar ought to be. In the process, found a stone sarcophagus here, lots of mortar bedding for tiles laid diagonally, then a step down here into an area where tiles were laid longitudinally, and then also there were shallow foundations which may have supported timber benches or something like that. So the working theory was that we had the choir of the church and the presbytery, which meant that the burial that we found on the first day was probably in the choir, which is where John Rouse had said Richard III was buried. So a bit of a surprise really at that stage. Now we didn't want to go public with this until we'd really got our story straight, and so we invited a specialist down from the county of Lincolnshire in northern England. He was a monastic specialist, and we got him to come and have a look and see whether he agreed with our layout of this area within the church. Meanwhile, we'd started digging the burial because we now knew it was within the church. So we got a licence from the Ministry of Justice to dig up to 6 burials. Anyway, we were having a meeting with this chap from up north, and we were suddenly disturbed in the meeting by Matthew Morris, who came from the other part of the site, and said to me, "You ought to come and have a look at what we're doing. It's really interesting." And I said, as all managers would, "Go away, we're having a meeting if you don't mind." But then he persisted and whispered in my ear, "You'll never guess what, but this burial that we're digging has got trauma to the skull and curvature of the spine." So that was for me the moment when, against all odds, it sounded as though we'd been successful. And I can't repeat in public, especially not here, what I actually said. But I did a little dance, but I just could not believe it. It was impossible. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a minute. So there's the church, and other things were found in there, more graves, plus things like copper alloy letters from tomb inscriptions, these nice inlaid floor tiles of the 13th century, Richard of Cornwall as King of the Romans. So lots of stuff to support it being the church. So here we are at the end of that phase of the investigation. We've got this is looking southwards, so here's our first trench, second trench, and then the third one within the playground. You'll notice, interestingly, that the windows of this school building are all fairly modern looking, and we subsequently discovered that actually they were originally perpendicular in style, but Victorian, and that the builders had replaced all the windows and dumped all of the tracery windows in the medieval church footprint, just to confound us in the future. So we had to egg on our chin for that, rather. Anyway, so what that then leaves you is the church running across in this direction in the foreground, and then we've got the chapter house, and we've got the cloister somewhere here, running underneath all these buildings and adjacent roads. So when Cheryl and other Shreveportians came to visit, they could still see the lines of where the trenches were. This is all now covered with a new visitor centre. So here we are at that stage of the investigation then. We've got clear evidence for where the church is, and we can see really clearly that the grave is tucked into the choir. So you walk from the walking place through a screen, and on your right would have seen this tomb of Richard III. So it's in an interesting spot. It's high status, but not very high status. It should have been really put in front of the high altar. So I see it as a sort of grudging acknowledgement that it's the King of England, and it's somewhere where the public can't go and see it, pay homage, and cause problems for Henry Tudor. So critically, we've got all this evidence now of context for where the burial is, which all adds to the overall picture of deciding whether or not this is genuinely Richard III. Now, the next thing is then to look at the grave itself. This is the west end or the head end of the grave, emptied of its skeleton, really just to illustrate to you what an irregular looking grave it is. It's not very well dug. A normal grave you might expect, like this one also at Greyfriers, to be vertical sides, right angle corners and a flat base to take a coffin. This one is nothing like that. It undulates all over the place. The other thing to say about it is that it's amazing it survived at all, because you've got disturbance at the top from these outbuildings. You've got disturbance at this end where the walking place would be. That's all a big hole where they grubbed out stone in the 19th century. And then in this area it's also been destroyed. So some of these disturbances come within 2 or 3 inches of the skeleton itself. Right, now we'll look at the skeleton itself in situ. So we've turned round slightly now. I think one of the first things that strikes you about the burial is that the head and the upper torso are propped up at the end of the grave. They should be laid flat. And it means that the grave is actually too short for the person placed within it. Next thing is that there is no evidence for a coffin. You normally find impressions of a coffin. There's no evidence for rusty coffin nails either. Also, if this individual had been wrapped in a shroud really tightly, as the body decayed over 500 years, it would leave the bones in a very compact disposition, but these are quite spread out. So it looks as though this person's been buried with a minimum of covering, and certainly no coffin or shroud. Also, interestingly, the hands cross over the right hip, which is also unusual in burials we've looked at in Leicester. It may mean that they were tied at the time of burial, so that's unusual as well. You can see very clearly the curvature of the spine. You can see that the bones are in good condition. The soils in Leicester are such that they would have survived for another 5,000 years quite happily. You'll also notice that the feet are missing. The awful joke, he was defeated at Bosworth, but no, sorry. It's more likely it's to do with 18th century gardeners digging garden trenches and not noticing the very small bones of the feet. Next, look at it from the other angle, and you can see what I mean really about how the head is at a very odd angle, propped up against the end of the grave. This is why it took the person digging it, Dr. Jo Appleby, by surprise, because she thought it was perhaps another burial that was lying on top, because you often get stacked burials in these graveyards. They also intercut a lot. The other thing to mention about the digging of it is it's not a case of just getting a paintbrush and flicking off some dust. It's sticky clay, so you have to use quite heavy tools to actually get to this stage. But anyway, you can see very clearly how the arms cross. You can see the curvature of the spine very clearly. Full set of teeth, that one's just dropped into the grave. But they could see that there was trauma to the skull actually while it was in the ground. Now, it looks really as if obviously we found Richard III. It's got all these characteristics that are correct and it's in the right place, etc. But that's not going to be enough to convince the world that it's the right person. And one of the first things we've got to do is to say what date it is. There are no grave goods buried with Christian burials normally. We occasionally get papal bullas, these lead seals attached to papal documents, but not very often. So nothing was buried with him. We found a few bits of pottery that come up from earlier levels, from the Roman levels, but they're not buried with him. So we then have to resort to scientific dating, using something called radiocarbon dating. This is a technique that relies on the fact that we all absorb carbon from food, and one of the isotopes of carbon, carbon-14, is radioactive, and when we die, that carbon isotope decays at a known rate, and so you can then date the date of death. One of the problems with it is that if you consume lots of shellfish, for example, you can distort the dating because the shellfish themselves are also absorbing carbon but at a different rate. Anyway, so the first date came out with a 95% probability that this person died between 1430 and 1460, but which is a bit too early, obviously, for 1485. It was then remodelled taking into account this marine reservoir effect, but that made it even worse. So we ended up then with a date of 1455 to 1640, a very broad margin. But because we know the church is gone by 1540, we can actually disregard this part of the graph. So that then gives us a model date with a 95.4% probability that this person died between 1450 and 1540, which is broadly all right for Richard III, and it rules out lots of earlier friars and things on the site. As a byproduct of the radiocarbon dating, it also tells you a bit about what sort of diet they had. This is from isotope analysis, and it shows that this person had a very high protein diet, which was unusual amongst the lower classes in the medieval period. So this is a high status person, so that's also good for our analysis. Now we had a press conference immediately afterwards that said that we probably found Richard III and that we were now going to embark on a whole series of scientific tests. And one of the first ones was really to look at the skeleton itself with a team of osteologists and also the county forensic pathologist as well. So the skeleton was taken to the local hospital and put through the scanner to create a three-dimensional image of it. It then came back to the university where it was very carefully washed over sieves, ready for the team to start looking at the remains. That was when I had probably the worst phone call imaginable, bearing in mind all the press interest, when one of the younger members of staff said they thought it was a female, not a male. And you think, well, no, it can't be, but anyway, as it turned out, it was actually a very sensible thing to say, because as part of the sexing of the skeleton, you look at the pelvis, the skull, and the general size of the bones, And yes, it is a male, but it's a male with a very slight physique, a gracile physique. He would have stood about 5'8" tall, not allowing for the spinal abnormality. Died between the ages of 30 and 34. Richard III was 32. He has this abnormality, which is idiopathic adolescent onset scoliosis, which we'll come back to in a minute. But no other abnormalities like you might expect if you believe the Shakespeare description, things like withered arms and so on, nothing like that. But certainly a very slight build. Now they're very careful then to look at the historical sources afterwards, and what they tell us is really that the osteology is about right. So for example, Rouse, late 1480s, says that Richard was small of stature, with a short face, unequal shoulders, the right higher and the left lower. And then Nicholas von Poppelau, who's a Silesian knight visiting England, who meets Richard III, he doesn't helpfully tell us what his own physique's like, but he tells us that Richard is a high-born prince, 3 fingers taller than I, but a bit slimmer, not as thick-set as I am, and much more lightly built. He has quite slender arms and thighs, and also a great heart. So that also tallies with this idea of a sort of gracile figure. There is one other reference to the Irish Countess of Desmond dancing with Richard III, who suggested he was light-footed, but I think when you look at the age that she would have been, it would have been 104, so it's not very likely. So we'll rule that one out. So here's the evidence for the spinal abnormality. These are 2 of the vertebrae which should be symmetrical. As you can see, they're very much not symmetrical. And the way the team modelled this was to use this new 3D printing technology to print out each of the individual vertebrae and then string them together to simulate what it would have been like in life. If this works, yes, what it shows you is it's a sort of corkscrew shape rather than a flat shape. It certainly would have left his right shoulder higher than the left, as Rouse had said. It's difficult to know whether it would have occurred as a result of environmental factors or whether it's genetic, and there's more work being done on the DNA that might tell us the answer to the sort of genetic question. It's also difficult to know how much it would have affected his ability to lead a normal life. Certainly he'd already ridden all over the kingdom. He'd ridden down from Nottingham to Leicester and then led the charge in the battle, so maybe it wasn't too much of a problem at the age of 32, but would have got worse almost certainly. Next thing then is really how did he die? A number of what are called perimortem injuries were noted on the skeleton, principally on the skull. So perimortem means at or around the time of death, so you can't necessarily tell the sequence of these injuries. The particularly critical ones are shown here, so you can just about see there this sort of shallow disc-shaped Death Star type injury, somebody called it. And there are 3 of those on the top of the skull, and when you look at the injuries under a microscope, you can see striations which are made by the nicks on the blade of the weapon that's inflicted the injury. And what that shows is that the same weapon actually inflicted 2 of these injuries. They wouldn't necessarily have been life-threatening unless left for a long time. It certainly would have been profuse bleeding. And a surgeon did tell me that he'd seen a similar example from a road traffic accident where if it had been left unquenched, the person would have been dead within a matter of an hour anyway. Also in the top of the skull, there's a penetrating wound just here, where a dagger has been banged straight into the top of the skull. It's been done with such force that it's created flaps of bone that come down on the, you see that down there on the bottom one. And you can also see a flap of bone in the top one, looking in the inside of the skull. Amazingly, this isn't thought to have killed him either. It's not gone quite deep enough. But it's thought to have been inflicted by something called a rondelle dagger that has a square section blade, and it typically is used to deliver the coup de grace, as you can see in these grisly illustrations at the bottom and up here as well. But the more serious injuries seem to be on the base of the skull. And as Jo Appleby, the osteologist, says to her students, there are some holes that are not meant to be there. And one in particular is this one. And this is where a huge platelet of bone has been displaced following a blow, probably from a halberd, a staff weapon. Now, I ought to mention that this is all teamwork, and we've had not only Leicester University people, but also a chap called Bob Savage from the Royal Armouries as well. So he's a weapons specialist, and they've looked at what might have inflicted these injuries. And so it's thought this is probably from a halberd, which is a long staff with a sort of an axe-like head on the end and a pointy bit as well. So that's displaced that piece of bone, which was found actually in the grave. And the second injury is the one up there. That's a penetrating wound. And there was evidence for a nick on one of the vertebrae, suggesting a sword or a long dagger had been thrust upwards, hitting a vertebra, then up into the skull, and then hitting the top of the skull, which obviously would have caused death instantaneously. I'm sorry to be doing this straight after breakfast, but it's quite important as part of the identification of who it is, really. So those are the serious injuries. Now, interestingly, when you look at a typical suit of armour, as this person who's dressed as Richard III, the protection around the head is extremely good, particularly around the back of the neck and the chin and everything. So it suggests that certainly he was unhelmeted when these injuries were inflicted. However, the lack of injuries elsewhere on the body may mean that he was still wearing the rest of his suit of armour. So you might expect some defensive wounds as you put your arms up to protect yourself. The team then looked carefully at the historical accounts afterwards to see whether they tallied, and so the first one, Molinet says one of the Welshmen then came after him and struck him dead with a halberd. That's traditionally Rhys-ap Thomas. And then there's a poem in honour of Rhys-ap Thomas. I won't try the Welsh, but killed the boar, shaved his head. And then the Ballad of Lady Bessie down here, they beat his basnet to his head until the brain came out with blood. They never left him till he was dead. So it all tallies pretty well with the osteology. Now on the front of the skull, not many injuries. There's just a couple. One on the right-hand side of the face, a penetrating wound. And there's also a nick on the jawbone as well. And what's interesting really is that there aren't more. The skulls from the Battle of Towton were horribly disfigured. And it may be that Henry Tudor actually prevented people from disfiguring the skull so it would remain recognisable. Can't be sure. One of the possibilities is that the cut on the chin is actually somebody cutting the strap to his helmet and pulling it off, but we can't be sure. Well, then two more injuries elsewhere on the skeleton. One is on the 10th rib. There's a little cut mark just there, and this is thought to be an insult injury, perhaps when he's already dead and he's been slung naked over a horse and somebody's taken a sort of stab at his back. Like that. And then there's another one on the pelvis, which is, you can see just here, and this is again thought to be an insult injury where somebody stabbed him in the nether regions as an insult to his memory. There is a slight possibility that this one could have occurred actually in the battle, because as you can see in this illustration at the bottom, down here, the nether regions are not protected very well by the male coat, so you could potentially find a weak spot there, but we're not sure. So that's the accepted wisdom at the moment. Okay, so far then, our case for it being Richard III is based on its context within the friary buildings. It's within the choir of the church. It's in a hastily dug grave. No coffin, no shroud. The person's died a violent death. He's the right age to be Richard III, and he also has this abnormality. So probably 30 years ago, that would have been enough for most people to say it's Richard III. What we were always going to do with this project was to try DNA analysis to see if we could actually prove it. Now, because Richard III has no direct descendants, you can't use male line DNA down a direct line. So instead, we were going to use mitochondrial DNA, which is a form of DNA which goes down, is passed through the egg. So it goes to sons and daughters. Obviously, only daughters can pass it on. And the idea is that you can then track this up and down the tree and make links between different generations. Now, when we look at the House of York, here is Edward IV and his brother Richard, his brother George, and his sisters. Now, Richard III has no direct descendants. Edward IV's sons were the princes in the Tower. This one dies young. I think George's son doesn't have any descendants either. So that rules all of the males out. It leaves us with the sisters, particularly Anne of York, the elder sister. Now, as it turned out, there'd been a family tree traced for Anne of York down a female line back in the early 19th century, early 20th century. So that comes down this female line down to somebody called Joy Brown, later Joy Ibsen, a Canadian. And she then passed this DNA on to her son, Michael Ibsen, a Canadian cabinet maker living in London. So the theory was that we could take Michael's DNA and compare it with the DNA extracted from deep within one of the teeth of the skeleton. And if we could prove a link there, that would then add to the case for it being Richard III. Now, to be absolutely certain with the family trees, you have to really check all of the references really, really carefully. So Professor Kevin Shearer went through it with a fine-tooth comb, referenced it all, had a bulletproof family tree, and in the process identified a second lineage going down to somebody called Wendy Duldig, who happened to be a New Zealander living in London. So a bit of a stroke of luck there, really. She was telephoned about 3 times, but each time thought it was somebody having a bit of a joke at her expense. I mean, if somebody rang you and said, you're related to Richard III, you might think, yeah, go away, you know. Anyway, so the theory was that we could then compare Michael's DNA with Wendy's DNA, and if they matched, you might then get a link back to the skeleton on the site, and it would be a stronger identification of it being Richard III. Now, of course, the public, we'd had this press conference, and of course the public all thought that it was like CSI in Miami or whatever it is, and we'd sort of put the sample in one machine and a ticket would come out the other end the same day, saying who it was. But no, it's not like that. It took months and months and months of very hard work by Professor Turi King and her team, using labs in York and in Toulouse in France. And eventually on February the 3rd of 2013, we all assembled at the university with these descendants, Michael and Wendy, and we were told then that there was actually a good link. So here's part of the DNA profile. Here's Michael Ibsen's. It's obviously much more complex than this. Here's Wendy's, and then here's skeleton 1. So there's a perfect match between skeleton 1 and Michael, and then a 1 base at a difference between Michael and Wendy. So all this really meant that we could then confidently the next day say that beyond reasonable doubt, these were the remains of Richard III. Interestingly, obviously Michael can't pass on the mitochondrial DNA. He has a sister who's past childbearing age, and his brother can't pass it on. And then Wendy Duldig is also past childbearing age. So really the mitochondrial DNA line stops there. So it was very fortuitous that it all happened when it did. In 30 years' time, it would have been impossible. Now, more recently, Turi King's been trying some work on the male line DNA, going back to an earlier common ancestor, so up to Edward III. So now we know it's Richard III. Theoretically, you could trace the male line DNA coming down to modern-day descendants of Edward III. Except that when the samples were processed, it showed that there was not a DNA match, which means it's what they euphemistically call false paternity events have occurred in this family tree. Say no more. But it doesn't affect the overall identification, but there are at least 2 of these events that have occurred within this family tree. Now, having made the identification, meanwhile, Caroline Wilkinson, a forensic facial reconstruction specialist, had been working on a skull. She didn't know whose skull it might be, to do a facial reconstruction, paid for by the Richard III Society. And here is the skull, and then here is what she created. Personally, I didn't used to set much store by these things, but it's actually rather a compelling image when you look at it in relation to the earliest known portrait. Obviously ignoring the fact that the colouring is all based on portraits, but the actual shape of the face I think works very well with the portrait. More recent DNA analysis suggests that he has blue eyes and probably had blonde hair as a child. So the one that's on display in the visitor centre now has slightly lighter hair and blue eyes. But quite a compelling image, really. One or two other little things have been done to learn a bit more about the skeleton. One is looking at isotope analysis. Oxygen isotopes tell you about drinking water supplies. Now, because we know it's Richard III now, there are certain bones that have different renewal rates. So, for example, the rib tells us about the last 3 years of his life. The right femur, the thigh bone, tells us between the age of 17 and 32, and then the teeth tell us about when he was between 3 and 14. And what's interesting is when you compare the samples with this isotopic map of the British Isles, it shows that in his early years he's in this sort of pale green zone, which tallies with historical evidence that he's brought up in that particular area. And when he's an adolescent, he moves into the yellow zone on the borders with Wales. Again, that tallies with the historical evidence. And then back into the green zone as an adult. And then curiously, when he's king, he seems to be in these red zones in southwest Ireland and also down in France as well, making it look like he's had a continental holiday. But actually, it's probably more likely that he's drinking lots of imported wine now he's become king from the continent. And then similarly, the evidence from carbon and nitrogen isotopes tells you about food. And when he's king, these are the red dots up here. See those up there. They're telling you that he's eating higher trophic species, wildfowl, freshwater fish and things like that. Whereas most other people, these dots, the green ones and the sort of purpley ones are from ordinary folk who don't actually get much meat or fish, so have very simple diets. And it's quite interesting when you look at this list of animals eaten at his coronation feast. So quite a lavish, so crane and heron and cygnets and sturgeon, crayfish, you name it, all very rich things. So we've learned a lot more again about what he was, what his lifestyle was. Then finally, it wasn't all particularly good when he was alive. He suffered from an intestinal parasite known as roundworm. So samples were taken from the burial and surrounding soils and sieved, and the egg casings of roundworm came out. This is a parasite that develops through poor personal hygiene. Probably not Richard, but his serving staff and cooks and things. But pretty not unusual in the medieval period. So the project as a whole has been incredibly fulfilling, and we've had a wonderful team of people. It's not something you do single-handed. You have a team of archaeologists and a team of specialists back at base. And we've learnt a huge amount about Richard III. Obviously, we can't tell you what his character was. That will still remain a mystery, and that's probably what keeps the interest in him alive, I would say. But I think for me, the other important thing to say is that we've also contributed to our knowledge of Leicester in the medieval period, and we're particularly interested in telling the story of our city, and so all of the evidence for the friary, as shown in this reconstruction by another university in the city, just helps people to understand what the urban landscape was. So this is what we think the friary looked like. So here's the church with its walking place and central tower, cloisters, chapter house, and there's St Martin's church, now cathedral. And as we should crash through the west window of the church in a minute. Hold tight. So we go into the church. We now know that it's got a north aisle from documentary sources. We then go through a timber screen, probably a bit more chunkier than this one, I'd say. Then we're in the walking place, and then into the choir. The pattern of floor tiles is based on archaeological evidence. There's a suggestion of what the tomb might have looked like. And then down the choir, up a step into the presbytery. And then finally back down the choir. So we don't actually know what the tomb looked like, but this is a University in Leicester suggested this, it might be something like this, but it could have been a lot less elaborate. No evidence for it at all survived. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed hearing about how we managed to identify these remains. And,